Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We also host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and this week with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we join the Israelites as they embark on a trip into the desert. We're perplexed to see that God sets the GPS to wander mode and puts them on a circuitous route rather than the coastal expressway. So get into the back seat and be prepared to badger the driver and learn a little something about long roads that are short as we explore God's gracious ruse. Well, welcome for our weekly trip. And this week we are really on a trip because the Israelis are off to the great adventure of 40 years in the desert. We are in Exodus 13, and it starts when it says, Now then, Pharaoh let the people go. God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer. For God said, the people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people round about by way of the wilderness at the Sea of Reeds. Now the Israelites went up armed out of the land of Egypt. And then it continues in Exodus 14. The Lord said to Moses, Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp before Pahirot, between Migdol and the sea, before Baal-Zippor, and you shall encamp facing it by the sea. Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, They are astray in the land. Nevuchim heim ba'aretz. The wilderness is closed in on them. Then I will stiffen Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them that I might gain glory through Pharaoh and all his host. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, and they did so. So we have a combination of two different travelogues, if you will, that God prepares for the Jewish people. One, even before he takes Pharaoh into consideration, he says, you know what, I'm not going to take you on the short path. I'm going to take you in a circuitous route. And he gives a reason because he's afraid they might have a change of heart. And then he looks at it from the perspective of Pharaoh and says, and there's going to be a real advantage here because he's going to think that the Jews are nevuchim. They are confused, and he'll see this as an opportunity for him to have a change of heart. So, Rabbi, what do you make of all this changing of hearts and circuitous routes?
The Jews were clearly not quite ready to leave Egypt. You know, they left because nobody wants to be a slave. But it's hard, you know, you can take the Jews out of slavery, but their mind still thinks like a slave. And the way a slave thinks is that the first hint of any problem, I just want to go back. At least when I'm a slave, I'm taken care of. I may be persecuted, but at least I'm taken care of. I get 3 meals. I have a place to sleep. And now we're going to get attacked on the way to Israel, and they're going to get afraid. Now, what's interesting is that God seems to be very much aware of this. God is like their psychologist. And he says, I can't take him that way. I have to take him indirectly, because only if I take him indirectly will they kind of learn how to be free. That's also, by the way, since we're talking about all this, that's why they don't get the Torah for 7 weeks. They need a little bit of time. They can't get the Torah immediately.
So I totally agree that there's almost a pedagogic aspect to all this. We are embarking on this great journey, and all of a sudden, by talking in terms of planning a trip and picking a route, we're almost given an opportunity to explore how does one move from one place to another, both physically, but also spiritually and psychologically. And I think that's going to be a large part of the conversation. But before we even get there, this also seems to be a little bit of a prophecy or a prequel or a forecasting. I think most of us who know the Torah believe that the Jews at a certain point were punished to die in the desert. The generation that left Egypt was punished, whether it was at the golden calf, whether it was when the spies came back and they cried. And here we have, like we have many times, this sense of it was predestined, or there are multiple reasons for the same event. Let me just read a little bit from the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael. And it says, "And Pharaoh said, he said, and he did not know what he was saying," meaning, unbeknownst to him, he was prophesizing. He was saying that Moses was leading them without knowing, but Nevuchim prophetically intimates what was going to happen. And then it even has a word play. It says, another variant is, "And Pharaoh said, without knowing what he was saying with regard to Israel, they are destined livkot," as in Nevochim livkot, there's a play on words in the desert. "And the entire congregation lifted their voices, and the people cried, Vayikvu, Israel was destined to fall in the desert." So they're almost finding excuses to tie this premonition here that the Jews, God wanted the Jews to go in circles, listovev, not so much as a punishment, but as a prophecy. But it does seem to be a rather profound message of this was necessary.
Yeah, I mean, this was necessary. The question, Geoffrey, really is, what's it necessary for?
So that's the
right. I think
$1 million question.
That's really what we need to talk about tonight. You're right. The Torah itself, even before you get to the Mechilta, the Torah itself says it was necessary. Had they done it the other way, it would have been bad. So it was necessary. But nobody tells you exactly what it was necessary for. So I gave this theory that they had to get the slave mentality out of their system. But really, I made that up. Why doesn't the Torah tell us why it's necessary?
So I think if you look at the actual verses that we just read, it says the people may have a change of heart when they see war. Pen yinachem ha'am be'otem milchama. Maybe it's war, maybe it's trouble, maybe it's a tribulation, maybe it's hard work, and return to Egypt. And of course, returning to Egypt is something that we see throughout the book of Exodus. Wherever things get tough, their first response is nostalgically to say, let's go back to Egypt. So I think even in the verses themselves, in terms of the mindset of the Jews, there is this sense that God changed the travelogue in order to ensure that the Jews would be protected from making that knee-jerk reaction and heading home at the first sight of whether it was war or some sort of turmoil, stress, or challenge.
But it's really unbelievable because can you imagine being a slave and going back to slavery? Now, I'm not an expert on the Civil War, but when the slaves were freed in the South after the Civil War, they had trouble. We know they had trouble. It took 100 years for there to be equal rights for black people. Did they go back? Did they ask to be slaves again? Were there a group that said it's better to be slaves than to be free? Maybe there were, but that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many. I mean, I think what it does is this points a little bit at how unique the Exodus story was and is. In terms of disruption, how many times do you have a people that has this opportunity to make a total paradigm shift? And I think that maybe makes this whole question of this pedagogic question that much more interesting. So let's start looking at how some of the classical commentaries look at this from a pedagogic point of view. The Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael in another place says, for it was near. They pick up on the verse that says he didn't want them to go through the Philistine route because it was too near. The Holy One, blessed be He, did not bring them directly to Eretz Yisrael, but by way of the desert, saying, if I bring them there now, immediately, miyad is the Hebrew word, each man will seize his field and each man his vineyard, and they will neglect Torah study. Rather, I will keep them in the desert 40 years, eating manna and drinking from the well, and the Torah will be absorbed in their bodies. From here, Rabbi Shimon would say the Torah was given to be expounded only by the eaters of manna, and like them, the eaters of teruma. So this is kind of fascinating.
That's kind of funny.
It's written. I mean, there are two aspects of it. The first aspect I absolutely love, where he picks up on this thing about karov, about being near, and he moves it from something that is temporal in terms of space to something that is from a perspective of time. That there is an evolution that had to occur. You can't get a miracle. You can get miracles in Egypt. You can get miracles at the Red Sea. You can't change a person's heart or a person's mind in the same miraculous fashion. Then, of course, he transitions into a yeshiva student or teacher and talks about the best way to study Torah is in the desert, away from distractions. But again, it's wonderful that from this perspective, and many that we'll see, they all saw these few verses as the paradigm of how does one create change inside of a person and inside of a people.
Right. That's correct. That's really the story of 40 years in the desert. The reason for 40 years in the desert was in order to create that paradigm shift, where the Jews go from being slaves in Egypt to being free people. You know, there is work done. I'm not sure about what happened after the Civil War, but there is a lot of work done about countries that have revolutions. And it's interesting that very often the one who leads the revolution is not the one who's a successful leader of the country going forward. It needs a transition phase. And that's really what you have in the Torah. You have a transition phase. And if you want to be honest, Moshe, who's the one who leads them out, he's the liberator, can't be the one who takes them into the land of Israel.
You know, I think that's a good point, but I'd also kind of argue that we're not yet. I mean, these verses include a premonition, and they already have a premonition about wandering in the desert. I don't think the premonition is yet here that after the wandering you won't get into the land. I think that's another step.
Not, but I'm just saying that it's interesting. This is the beginning of that process that will lead us there. Absolutely.
But
and by the way, you didn't talk about the fact that there's a lot of the complaining starts this week.
The complaining starts from day one.
Right? The complaining right there. They cross the sea. They see the biggest miracle in history. And what do? They complain.
So let's get back to some of the lessons that the classical commentaries take. The next I'm going to quote is Rabbeinu Bachaya, and he says that what we are just seeing is characteristic of the way God dealt with the Israelites in the desert. They were to be raised gradually. The word to a level of trust. And the word in Hebrew is b'madregot habitachon, degrees. You know, I think if there's one takeaway from tonight's discussion, is that faith doesn't come in a moment. Whether it's from the previous perspective of studying Torah, whether it's perspective of Rabbeinu Bachia, where you're trying to get faith, there's no fast food solution. There's no silver bullet. This question of a milchama could be a war, but it's also turmoil. There's an expression, we know it from the New Testament, it says, seek and thou shalt find. In the Talmud, it's yagata umatzata tamin. If somebody works hard at something and they find it, believe them. But if they say lo yagata v'matzata al tamin, if they say, nah, I just discovered this, I didn't work hard at all, don't believe him if he said he found the answer. So I think it's clearly this sense of degrees, and you find this so much in religious thinking, that one has to plod from one level to the next, that faith and understanding is cumulative. And Rabbeinu Bachia brings a number of examples, which I think are kind of interested. He says, this is why God parted the waters of the Sea of Reeds only a little bit at a time. That is why even at Marah, where God showed Moses how to make sweet water, which had become bitter sweet again, God went to the trouble of first miraculously making that water bitter and then performing a second miracle. And Rabbeinu Bachia goes on and on. He writes for another 3 paragraphs, giving his, exegesis on multiple miracles, where he shows that the idea is not to stun, the idea is not to shock. The idea is to gradually, madrega, step after step, bring a person from where they are to where they want to be. And I think that's very, he uses words like davar yom b'yomo, day after day, likvor b'nafshotam midat habitachon, to create in them this midah, this trait of faith. I think that's fascinating.
I think I would agree that is fascinating. What do you think he has in mind? What do you think? What's the bigger issue that he's really addressing in there?
Well, I think what he's saying is, from these verses we learn that going out on this journey is not simply about going to a destination, but it's how one gets there. And there's so much that needs to be learnt from that destination. There's a Hebrew expression that comes from the Talmud that talks about short paths that are long and long paths that are short. And I think that is part of what he's saying, that there are steps that need to be taken to achieve the desired result. So the Gemara in Eruvin said that there was an incident of a young boy. One time, the great Yehuda Hanassi was walking along the path, and he saw a young boy sitting at the crossroads. And I said to him, on which path shall we walk in order to get to the city? He said to me, this path is short and long, and that path is long and short. I walked on the path that was short and long. When I approached the city, I found that gardens and orchards surrounded it, and I did not know the trails leading through them to the city. I went back and met the young boy again and said to him, my son, didn't you tell me that this was short? He said to me, and didn't I tell you that it was also long? I kissed him on his head and said to him, happy are you, O Israel, for you are all exceedingly wise, from your old to your young. So I think it's a beautiful expression, kitsara va'arucha, arucha v'kitsara, the short path that is long, the quick fix that doesn't quite work, and the struggle that fixes everything. And I think ultimately that's also a kind of a character lying in this discussion.
I think that's a great idea. That idea that the quick fix doesn't work is definitely a lesson that we have from this week's parsha, from the very, very beginning, right? The quick fix was to go up the coast and to be in Israel in 11 days. 11 days. But that would have been the quick fix, and that would have been disastrous. The amazing thing is that from the beginning, God's watching out for the people. It's not in God's best interest either, if we're allowed to say, to have the quick fix and to have the people get scared and want to run back.
Absolutely. Well, God's part of the team, and
God says in the God says that the purpose of the plagues is to prove to the Egyptians and the Jews that God is God. It's interesting when Pharaoh ultimately throws the Jews out after the plague of the firstborn in last week's parasha. He says to Moses and Aaron, "Get out of here." And then he adds 3 words. He says, "And when you go and pray to your God, pray on my behalf too." I think those are the best 3 words in the whole Torah. Because right there, Pharaoh says, "I finally believe in your God. Pray for me too."
You reminded me about the 10 plagues. And as long as we're picking up on this sense of what Rabbeinu Bachia was saying about madregot, about degrees, in a sense, there's a real powerful theme here, even for the Egyptians, who ultimately God was trying to teach a lesson to. He didn't just go to the 10th plague. There's this sense of an evolution, of a transition, small steps. And I think that has to be one of the powerful lessons of the Parsha. So now we're going to transition to the most absolutely radical explanation for this going in circuitous routes and slowly. And it comes from a great rabbi and a great philosopher who also happened to be a great doctor. And he starts the discussion by talking about biology, and he's almost prescient in terms of, if you listen to what I'm going to read now, this almost sense of evolution. But his name is Rav Moshe ben Maimonides himself. And he writes in Guide for the Perplexed, and before I start, remember the Jews are nevuchim, they are confused in the desert. That's the name of the book we're going to be reading from, the Guide for the Nevuchim. He doesn't make the connection. This is only one of the radical ideas in his book, but maybe it's a seminal idea. So here we go, and he's talking about biology now. He says, on considering the divine acts or the processes of nature, we get an insight into God's willy graciousness. The Hebrew, and of course, the Moreh Nevuchim was written in Arabic. So when you say the Hebrew, you have to say who you're quoting.
That's funny.
We're quoting Tibon, who was the first translator of it. He goes, Aramat ha'elokot. The Arama, la'arom is to lie. So the deity's willy graciousness as displayed in the creation of animals, with the gradual development of the movements of their limbs and the relative position of the later, and we perceive also his willy graciousness. Now he uses a second word, tachluvot, which is kind of subterfuge, in the successive and gradual developments of the whole condition of each individual. And he goes through different animals, and he talks about how certain limbs are used at one time and then stop being used, but they have their value. And the most powerful final example that he gives is mammals who wean their children. He says, therefore, breasts were provided which yield milk, and the young can be fed with moist food, which corresponds to the condition of the limbs of the animal, until the later have gradually become dry and hard. So the breasts are full of milk for a while, and then the child matures and they dry up. It's an example of planned obsolescence, if you will. And he uses this discussion of biology to segue into how God educated the children of Israel. And he starts by saying it is impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. It is, according to the nature of man, impossible for him suddenly to discontinue everything which he has been accustomed. And he goes on to talk about how the ultimate goal of leaving Egypt, after all, he was an Aristotelian, was to contemplate the divine. And how do you get from living in as a slave in a society where there are idols and there are sacrifices? How do you get from there to this sublime state? And he writes, it was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God, as displayed in biology and the whole of creation, that he did not command us to give up and discontinue all these manners of service. For to obey such a commandment would be contrary to the nature of men. So he says, therefore, God allowed these kinds of services to continue. He created a temple. He created sacrifices. And he goes, I'm not going to wean you from sacrifices. I'm not going to wean you from bowing down and from touching a holy stone and looking in a particular direction to find God. I'm just going to change that so you go to my temple and you sacrifice to me. By this divine plan, it was effected that the traces of idolatry were blotted out, and the truly great principle of our faith, the existence of unity of God, was firmly established. Does Maimonides know how radical an idea he's saying is? That he's basically writing off all of the temple sacrificial cult as a stepping stone, as a necessary ruse, a trick to get people from one place to another? He continues, I know that you will at first reject this idea and find it strange. How can you suppose that all of these commandments were just employed not for themselves, but to go to something else? He goes, what would happen if somebody showed up today and told us, you don't have to wear tefillin, you don't have to pray 3 times a day, just contemplate God? He says, we would also be upset. But he says, it's written in the Torah, God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, though that was near. For God said, so he quotes our verse, and he says, here God led the people about, away from the direct road which he originally intended, because he feared they might meet on that way with hardships too great for their ordinary strength. He took them by another road in order to obtain thereby his original object. It was the result of God's wisdom that the Israelites were led out into the wilderness till they acquired courage. And he uses this same word of it was a divine ruse. It was a trickery, if you will. It was a very radical statement. I encourage you to go to the show notes in Sefaria and read the whole text that's built logically and forward. And that was his takeaway. And it's a radical takeaway if you take it to its full meaning, which that he was basically saying even the tefillin, everything that we do is a trick or a ruse, or I would say it in a more nice term, a tool to get us to somewhere else.
I like the word tool. It's a tool to get us where we need to go. It's not in itself a goal.
But it is a pretty radical idea.
Crazy, but fascinating. It's so good that everything we do is just to get us to the goal. But each one of these actions is not in itself valuable. Now, I think that Rambam would probably say that once you're going through them, though, you have to do them properly. Means let's take tefillin. So tefillin's not important for itself. It's important where it takes us. But to put on tefillin wrong, to do the wrong act in the ritual, to perform the Seder incorrectly, to observe Yom Kippur indirectly, I don't think Rambam would like that either.
Not like that. I mean, here's a man who dedicated his life to codifying Jewish law.
Right, detail. That's what I'm saying. Means the codification of the detail is important because it leads us somewhere else. Don't think the ultimate is just putting on the tefillin. It's where the tefillin are a tool to get us where we need to go.
So we're running out of time, but let me give you a little bit of the history of this idea. The Ramban, Nachmanides, in Leviticus, absolutely goes ballistic against Maimonides for saying this. And he says, how could you possibly say this? You're belittling the sacrifices which actually Noah gave. And he goes on and on. We have to remember that Ramban lived in a Christian world. He actually had to go into debate with Christians. And this concept that the laws don't really matter, that it's the spirit that counts, smacks a lot of Christianity. And my sense is that those rabbis who defended Maimonides, like the Abarbanel and others, maybe they were less exposed to the Christian ideas. But here's the amazing thing. In Christianity, they built a whole philosophy on this idea, and it's called divine condescendence. And it goes back to the church fathers, and they literally, we talked about classical commentators. Some of them use this to explain that education is like with children, that you have to start somewhere and you slowly grant. Saint Irenaeus deserves special mention as a rare instance of a church father who relates divine condescendence to an evolutionary concept of the Hebrew people, in which they pass gradually as a collective from an infantile to an adult state. They have more variations on this concept than we have. And my guess is for those scholars that, like Shai held, that are finding ideas that we had that were taken by Christians and taken in a farther direction, this idea of divine condescendence is certainly one of them. But Maimonides, either because of his biological background or because he lived in a Muslim world and wasn't part of replacement theology, he wasn't afraid of saying that Judaism could evolve, was able to say this. And again, it kind of reflects what we were talking about last week. And what you were just saying, Rabbi, that you can believe that the understanding of the law can evolve and still keep it. You can keep it the way it was originally observed, but as you grow as a person and as you grow as a nation, your understanding can evolve as far as you want. And I think that's really the theme here and the theme of what God is telling the Jewish people as they embark on this amazing journey.
I think that's beautiful. Thank you so much for the topic. Shabbat shalom to everybody. Enjoy crossing the sea. And next week, we look forward to receiving the Torah, the 10 Commandments with all of you.
Wow.
Be well. Shabbat shalom.
So soon. Amazing. Shabbat shalom to you all. Let's all cross the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, and begin the journey. Thank you so much.